There's a version of Catherine Oxenberg's story that sounds like a fairy tale. Royal blood, dynasty, diamonds, Joan Collins on the screen next to you, 100 million viewers watching every week. And then there's the actual story. The one where the royalty came without a country. The fame came without staying power. And the most defining battle of her life had nothing to do with Hollywood at all. It had to do with her daughter, a man named Keith Raniere, and one of the most dangerous organizations to emerge in modern American history. But before any of that, she was just a little girl growing up in London with a family tree that was, to put it mildly, unlike anyone else's. Segment 6, a family tree like no other. Catherine Oxenberg was born on September 22, 1961 in New York City to two people who had almost nothing in common and somehow found each other anyway. Her father, Howard Oxenberg, was a self-made American businessman of Russian Jewish descent whose family originally came from Vitebsk in what is now Belarus. He had built his wealth in the textile and garment industry in New York, and he moved in elite social circles, a close friend of the Kennedy family by most accounts. He was successful, grounded, and entirely of the world he'd built for himself. Her mother was something else entirely. Princess Elizabeth of Yugoslavia, born April 7, 1936 in the White Palace in Belgrade, was the only daughter of Prince Paul of Yugoslavia and Princess Olga of Greece and Denmark. That lineage alone could take up its own video. Princess Olga was the daughter of Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia, a Romanov, and Prince Nicholas of Greece. Through that line, Catherine Oxenberg traces descent from Russian imperial blood, Greek royalty, and the Serbian House of Karađorđević, the dynasty that ruled Serbia and later Yugoslavia for generations. Catherine's grandmother, Princess Olga, was also the sister of Princess Marina, who married the Duke of Kent, intertwining the family tree with the British royal family in ways that are easier to show on a diagram than explain in words. As of 2009, Catherine Oxenberg held position number 1387 in the line of succession to the British throne. She is a second cousin once removed of King Charles III. She is also a third cousin of King Felipe VI of Spain and of Prince William. She was a third cousin once removed of the late Queen Margrethe II of Denmark and traces connections to Norway, Luxembourg, and Belgium through the same extended web. She was also named, deliberately, after one of her distant ancestors, Empress Catherine the Great of Russia. That's the kind of family where naming conventions carry serious weight. Howard and Princess Elizabeth married on January 21, 1960 in Manassas, Virginia, and Catherine was born the following year. Her younger sister, Christina, arrived in December 1962. By 1966, when Catherine was just 5 years old, the marriage had ended. The strains of a union bridging such completely different worlds, a New York garment trade businessman, and an exiled European princess, proved too much. They divorced and Princess Elizabeth took the girls to London. What Catherine grew up with then was not a royal court. It was something stranger and in its own way, lonelier. A life steeped in aristocratic heritage that no longer had a country attached to it. Yugoslavia had abolished its monarchy in 1945, so the grandeur her mother came from existed largely in memory and in the manner with which people held themselves. You knew you came from something, but something just wasn't there anymore. Catherine attended the Lycée Français Charles de Gaulle in Kensington, London. She later graduated from St. Paul's School, a prestigious prep school in Concord, New Hampshire. She was accepted to Harvard University as part of the class of 1985, and then deferred her enrollment for a year to pursue modeling, which turned into a longer detour than anticipated. She eventually enrolled at Columbia University, studying philosophy, psychology, and mythology, but never completed her degree. Her first modeling job came very early. She was photographed at the age of 4 by Cecil Beaton, one of the most celebrated portrait photographers of the 20th century. His subjects over the decades had included Audrey Hepburn, Coco Chanel, and members of the British royal family. That Catherine Oxenberg was in front of his lens, as a 4-year-old says something about the world her mother moved in. By the time she was a teenager, she was modeling professionally. Her face would eventually appear on the covers of Cosmopolitan, Glamour, and Interview. But there was one other figure who shaped those early years in an unusual way. Her mother, Princess Elizabeth, had a brief engagement in 1974 to actor Richard Burton. Yes, that Richard Burton, one of the most acclaimed stage and screen actors of his generation, celebrated for his work in Hamlet on Broadway and films like Beckett and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. The engagement didn't lead to marriage, but during that time, Burton gave Catherine personal acting lessons. She was 13 years old. That kind of mentorship from that particular person is not something most aspiring actresses have on their resume. None of this, though, was straightforward. The royal connection opened doors and created complications in equal measure. People were fascinated by the bloodline, and sometimes put off by it. The title she'd been given in some corners of the press, the real princess, was equal parts gift and burden. What she had was the bearing, the history, and the name. And a face that, by anyone's measure, was hard to look away from. The next chapter would put all of that to work in a way nobody quite expected. And what happened when she stepped in front of a camera for the very first time? It changed everything. Almost immediately. Segment 5, The Princess Who Played a Princess. There is something almost poetically symmetrical about how Catherine Oxenberg got her start in acting. She was 20 years old when she landed her first role in 1982. It wasn't a background part. It wasn't a guest spot on a minor TV show. Her first ever on-screen appearance was playing Diana, Princess of Wales, arguably the most watched woman on earth at the time, in the CBS television movie The Royal Romance of Charles and Diana. The film dramatized the courtship and marriage of the Prince of Wales and Lady Diana Spencer, which had captivated the world in 1981. The wedding had been watched by an estimated 750 million people globally. Casting for the role of Diana was not simple. You needed someone young, luminous, with a certain kind of aristocratic bearing, someone who could be believable as both a shy girl and a future royal. Catherine Oxenberg, who happened to be an actual descendant of European royalty, got the part on her first ever audition. The casting was noticed immediately. NXIVM, one of Hollywood's most powerful talent agencies, signed her the moment the film aired. The doors that had been partially opened by virtue of her lineage and her modeling work swung fully open with that single role. She returned to play Diana again 10 years later in the ABC television film Charles and Diana, Unhappily Ever After in 1992, which covered the deterioration of the royal marriage, a very different story to tell than the fairy tale version. By that point, the real events had caught up with the fiction in ways that made the second film something of an uncomfortable mirror. But between those two Diana roles came the part that would define her public identity for a generation. In 1984, television producer Aaron Spelling, the man behind some of the biggest primetime dramas of the era, including Charlie's Angels and The Love Boat, was looking to expand the cast of Dynasty. The show, which had premiered in 1981, was by then one of the most watched programs in the United States and abroad. Its world was exaggerated wealth, family warfare, and people with extraordinary cheekbones doing terrible things to each other in evening wear. Spelling had been watching Catherine's guest appearances on The Love Boat, and he cast her personally as Amanda Carrington, the long-lost secret daughter of Alexis Carrington, played by Joan Collins, one of the great screen presences of her generation, and of patriarch Blake Carrington, played by John Forsythe. The irony was not subtle. Catherine Oxenberg, who in real life could not claim a royal title of her own, was cast as a character whose secret birthright and aristocratic European connections became central plot points. Art and life winking at each other. Dynasty at that time was watched by an audience of roughly 100 million people worldwide each week. It was a phenomenon that had spread well beyond American living rooms, followed in Europe, in South America, in Australia, in markets where American primetime television had never quite reached that kind of saturation before. The show's Dallas-style drama pushed the limits of what evening television could get away with, and it leaned into that permission with full force. Amanda Carrington eventually married the fictional Prince Michael of Moldavia, a European royal wedding played out on screen by an actress with actual European royal blood. The show's producers probably thought it was a marketing detail. It was genuinely strange. Her most memorable scene from the entire run became part of television folklore, a confrontation with Sammy Jo, played by Heather Locklear, that ended with both of them in a swimming pool, fully dressed in cocktail wear after a hotel fire. It was staged absurdity of the highest order, and it was absolutely perfect for what Dynasty was. Television in the 1980s did not have a more satisfying image. She won 2 Soap Opera Digest Awards in 1985, Outstanding Supporting Actress and Outstanding Female Newcomer, and on May 10, 1986, she hosted Saturday Night Live, becoming the first and to this day only descendant of a royal family to host the show. It was a moment that captured exactly the strange duality she occupied. Famous enough to host one of television's most prestigious live programs, and famous specifically because of a combination of blood she'd been born with and a character she'd been hired to play. And then, within months of that milestone, everything stopped. By the summer of 1986, the situation had deteriorated fast. Catherine had heard a rumor, apparently unfounded at the time, that she was being dropped from the series, and while still in Europe, she stopped showing up to set. It was an act of protest, or perhaps negotiation, that backfired badly. Erin Spelling's response was unequivocal. Her publicist insisted she had left voluntarily. Multiple newspapers across the country reported the firing directly, including the Chicago Tribune and the San Francisco Chronicle. Spelling himself made his version of events perfectly clear in public. The character of Amanda was recast with actress Karen Salini, who had originally auditioned for a different role on Dynasty's spin-off series The Colbys, and was brought in at short notice because producers thought she bore a physical resemblance to Catherine. They even reshot parts of the iconic pool fight scene from the season 6 finale to insert Salini in place of Oxenberg, so the season 7 premiere's recap would be consistent. Salini lasted 13 episodes before the character of Amanda was written out entirely in the 1987 episode The Rig, and never mentioned again. Not killed on screen, not written off to another country, simply gone, as though she had never existed. In 2006, Catherine returned for the Dynasty reunion, Catfights and Caviar television special, reuniting with her former castmates. Whatever bitterness the departure may have left, she kept it largely private. She appeared graciously. She spoke about it with the kind of dry humor that comes from having had enough time to look back at something and find it slightly absurd. Whether she left or was pushed out, the outcome was the same. At the peak of her fame, with the world's attention on her, she was no longer on the most watched show on television. What comes next, when everything arrives that fast and then stops just as fast, is never easy to watch, and it wasn't. But the career struggles that followed were in some ways the least of what was coming. Segment 4, After the Spotlight. There is a particular kind of difficulty in trying to sustain a career after the kind of fame that Dynasty brought. The show had been such a specific, outsized thing, a cultural moment as much as a television program, that finding a role that could match it was genuinely hard. And Catherine was trying to do that while carrying things privately that very few people around her knew about. What didn't come out publicly until much later was that Catherine had experienced abuse as a child, not from her parents, but from someone within her extended family circle. She has spoken about it with real candor in the years since. That experience, buried during years of a public life that looked polished and privileged, had left its mark. From high school onward, she struggled with a severe eating disorder, a condition that followed her through her modeling years and her acting career simultaneously, invisible to the people watching her on screen, very much present in her daily life. These are not small things. They are the kinds of wounds that shape how a person moves through the world, how they make decisions, what they reach for, and what they pull away from. Understanding them matters for making sense of a life that, from the outside, can look like a series of inexplicable choices. In 1987, she starred in a television remake of Roman Holiday, the 1953 film that had made Audrey Hepburn a star and remains one of the most beloved films ever made. Playing a princess in a film forever associated with one of cinema's most luminous performances was, at best, an impossible comparison to invite. The production was not well funded. The script was a pale shadow of the original, and the reviews reflected both of those realities. It was the kind of project that probably looked like a reasonable bet on paper, a prestigious title, a role tailored to her image, and landed badly in practice. The following year, 1988, she appeared in The Lair of the White Worm, a horror film directed by Ken Russell, a genuinely eccentric filmmaker known for provocative, stylistically extreme work. The film was based on a Bram Stoker novel about an ancient serpent cult in rural England, and it starred alongside Amanda Donohoe and a very early Hugh Grant. It is now considered a cult film in certain circles, occasionally screened at late-night festivals, and fondly remembered by fans of unusual British horror. At the time, however, it was not the kind of project that mapped a clear path toward leading roles in major Hollywood productions. She worked through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, steadily, if not prominently. Still crazy like a fox, swimsuit, trench coat in Paradise, the kind of television movies that filled schedules and kept actors employed without leaving lasting impressions. Each one a job, each one further from the Dynasty years than the one before. In 1992, she reprised the role of Diana for the second time in Charles and Diana, Unhappily Ever After. The real marriage between Charles and Diana was disintegrating publicly during the same period the film aired, which gave it an uncomfortable timeliness. What had been a romantic story in 1982 was now something sadder, and Catherine sat in the middle of it again, playing the same woman 10 years on in a very different version of her life. From 1993 to 1994, she starred in Acapulco HEAT, a syndicated action series, in which she played a British intelligence operative working alongside a small team on various missions. It was fun enough for what it was, sun-drenched, action-oriented, uncomplicated, and it ran for one season before disappearing from schedules without much fanfare. Through all of this, Catherine was navigating her personal life with considerably less fanfare. In June 1991, she gave birth to her first daughter, India Riven Oxenberg. The identity of India's father was not publicly disclosed at the time. Catherine was raising her daughter alone in Coldwater Canyon, Los Angeles. It later emerged that India's father was William White Schaefer, a man who was arrested in 1992 on charges of smuggling marijuana from Thailand on a significant scale. Catherine never addressed it publicly at the time. It surfaced years later through legal documents and reporting. And she managed that reality entirely on her own without ever making it part of her public story. That alone, a single mother raising a child whose father had been arrested for drug trafficking, navigating all of this while trying to maintain a career in an industry that had already moved on from her biggest moment, is a portrait that the Dynasty years had done nothing to prepare anyone for. Then came the marriage that briefly made headlines for all the wrong reasons. On July 12, 1998, Catherine Oxenberg married Robert Evans in Beverly Hills. Evans was a legendary Hollywood figure, a producer whose career stretched from the 1960s onward, whose credits included Chinatown, The Godfather, and Rosemary's Baby, and who was known as much for his flamboyant personal life as for his filmmaking. He had been married 5 times previously. He was 68 years old. Catherine was 36. 9 days later, the marriage was annulled. Almost nothing about it was publicly explained. A 9-day marriage annulled without comment between one of Hollywood's most storied producers and an actress who had grown up with royal blood in her veins. It was, briefly, the strangest footnote in a career already full of them. Less than a year later, in May 1999, she married actor Casper Van Dien, whom she had met during the filming of a television movie called The Collectors. Van Dien was best known for starring in Starship Troopers in 1997. He was 7 years younger than Catherine. They married at the Graceland Wedding Chapel in Las Vegas on May 8, 1999, and the relationship appeared for a time genuinely joyful. Together they had 2 daughters, Maya, born September 20, 2001, and Celeste, born October 3, 2003. Having a third child at 42 is not a small thing, particularly for someone who had been managing the effects of a long-term eating disorder alongside everything else. Van Dien had a son and a daughter from a previous relationship, and the combined household became a large blended family. In 2005, the couple appeared together in a Lifetime reality series called I Married a Princess, which followed their domestic life. It drew modest viewership and ran for one season. Catherine was working, guest appearances, direct-to-video projects, occasional TV movies alongside Van Dyne, but the career that had once put her in front of 100 million people weekly was now something quieter and more scattered, the kind of career you maintain rather than build. In 2015, Van Dyne filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, ending 16 years of marriage. And then, in 2011, Catherine made a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, and would, over the following years, become the most consequential thing she had ever done. Because what happened after that decision didn't just affect her. It put her daughter in very real danger, and Catherine had no idea. Segment 3. The group that wasn't what it said it was. In 2011, Catherine brought her daughter India, then 19, to a workshop in California hosted by a company called NXIVM, pronounced like NXIVM. It presented itself as an executive success program, a self-help and personal development organization offering courses in leadership, communication, and professional growth. On the surface, NXIVM looked like dozens of other motivational training companies. Serious-sounding curriculum, business networking opportunities, testimonials from participants who described genuine personal transformation. A lot of people attended, including wealthy, educated, and professionally accomplished individuals. There was nothing in the initial presentation that struck most reasonable people as dangerous. Catherine herself later described finding some of the early material at least partially useful. She was not naive, and she was not reckless. She was a mother taking her adult daughter to a workshop. She withdrew from the program in 2013, sensing something was off without being able to fully name what it was. India did not withdraw. Over the following years, India became increasingly embedded in NXIVM's inner circles. She relocated to the Albany, New York area, where the organization was headquartered, and her connection to her mother grew strained and sporadic. She returned home only occasionally. When Catherine tried to raise concerns, India deflected, minimized, or defended the organization. These were not the responses of a daughter who was simply busy and happy. They were the responses of someone who had been carefully trained to treat outside concern as an attack to be resisted. What NXIVM actually was, beneath the leadership courses and the professional development framework, was something its founder, Keith Raniere, had constructed over decades. Raniere, who styled himself with the title Vanguard, had designed the organization as an elaborate system of psychological control, one that used loyalty, hierarchy, escalating commitment, and eventually blackmail to pull participants deeper in. The self-help courses were, for many members, genuine enough on the surface, but deeper in the organization, the picture was entirely different. Within NXIVM was a secret suborganization called DOS, a Latin phrase roughly translating to master over obedient female companions. DOS operated as a rigid hierarchy of masters and slaves, where women were required to provide deeply personal secrets and compromising material as a form of so-called collateral, presented to them as a symbol of trust and commitment. In reality, it was a mechanism of control. If a woman tried to leave, the collateral could be used against her. That was the point. India Oxenberg was recruited into DOS in January 2015 by Alison Mack, an actress known to millions for her years playing Chloe Sullivan on the television series Smallville. Mack had herself been drawn deep into NXIVM's inner workings, and had become one of the key figures within DOS, recruiting women under her and enforcing the organization's requirements on them. Under Mack's direction, India was required to hand over compromising personal material, adhere to extreme restrictions on her food intake, follow rigid requirements on how much she slept, and progressively reduce contact with people outside the organization, including her mother. In January 2016, India was told she would participate in a ceremony that had symbolic meaning. That she would receive a mark representing the 4 elements. What she was actually given was a brand, a permanent physical mark, and it was not a symbolic emblem. It was Keith Raniere's initials. Catherine did not know the full details for some time, but she knew something was deeply wrong. Wrong enough that normal conversation couldn't reach it. India had become someone who seemed fundamentally different from the daughter she had raised. And the most alarming thing was that when Catherine carefully raised her concerns, India said she didn't see a problem. To Catherine, a daughter who had been kept on severe food restrictions, required to follow rigid behavioral rules, cut off from most of her outside relationships, and given compromising material that could be deployed against her at any time, saying there was no problem was precisely the most alarming answer she could have given. When a woman who had left the organization finally contacted Catherine and explained the extent of what India had been experiencing, Catherine later described the moment of full understanding as one that nearly broke her entirely. Years of pieces that hadn't quite fit suddenly locked into place, and the picture they formed was something she had not been prepared for. Getting India out was not going to be as simple as making a phone call. Catherine was about to learn what it costs to go up against an organization that had spent years building walls around itself. Segment 2: The Fight. Catherine Oxenberg did not have the resources that some NXIVM members' families had. The organization had benefited significantly from the involvement of Sarah and Claire Bronfman, heiresses to the Seagram's liquor fortune, who had substantial wealth into its operations, including legal infrastructure built specifically to suppress outside scrutiny. Catherine was working largely alone with limited funds, and up against an organization that had demonstrated repeatedly that it knew how to respond to people who pushed back. She started by trying to talk to India directly, carefully, and without accusation. India knew about the branding. She acknowledged it. And she told her mother she didn't see it as a problem. That exchange, a daughter marked without her full understanding defending the person who had marked her, captures what made this situation so difficult to navigate through ordinary means. Reason and love by themselves were not enough. Catherine reached out to law enforcement. She compiled information carefully and filed it with appropriate authorities. She eventually met directly with New York's Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, delivering a detailed dossier she had assembled with the help of Frank Parlato, NXIVM's former publicist, who had broken with the organization and become one of its most persistent and vocal critics. Together, they worked to get the story into the hands of people positioned to act on it. She also received threats, phone calls and emails warning her against continuing. She was told she would be in danger if she traveled to Mexico, where the organization maintained a significant presence. Frank Parlato later corroborated that both he and Catherine had received what they understood to be genuine warnings about their safety. Neither of them stopped. In October 2017, the New York Times published a major investigation into NXIVM, reporting on the branding rituals, the psychological control structure, and the use of compromising material to hold women inside the organization. The story had enormous impact. It drew the attention of federal investigators in a way that individual complaints had not been able to achieve, and the years of work that Catherine, Parlato, and others had done to build the case and get it to the right people had helped lay the foundation that made the investigation possible. In March 2018, Keith Raniere was arrested in Mexico, where he had been hiding. Allison Mack was arrested in April of the same year. Both were indicted on federal charges that included racketeering, conspiracy, and a range of crimes related to the harm inflicted on women within DOS. Raniere did not testify at his trial. After 6 weeks of federal court proceedings, he was convicted on all counts: racketeering conspiracy, forced labor conspiracy, wire fraud conspiracy, and sex trafficking. In October 2020, he was sentenced to 120 years in federal prison. Claire Bronfman was sentenced to nearly 7 years. Allison Mack received 3 years and was released in 2023. 5 of Raniere's associates were convicted in total. India Oxenberg left the organization in the summer of 2018 in the months following Raniere's arrest, when the full weight of what had been built around her became impossible to deny. She moved back to Malibu to her mother. Their relationship, which had been devastatingly strained across years, began the slow and careful work of rebuilding. India published her memoir, Still Learning, in 2020, speaking in her own voice for the first time about what she had lived through. The Starz documentary series, Seduced, Inside the NXIVM Cult, that same year, allowed her to tell her story directly without it being filtered through anyone else's account. India has since built a life outside all of it. She married Patrick D'Ignazio, a chef, in December 2020, and they welcomed their first child in 2024. Catherine produced the television film Escaping the NXIVM Cult, a mother's fight to save her daughter in 2019, and was prominently featured in HBO's acclaimed documentary series The Vow. She established the Catherine Oxenberg Foundation to provide resources to former NXIVM members and others leaving similar organizations, covering exit counseling costs and helping people rebuild their lives. When she spoke publicly about why she chose to document all of it, despite what it cost her own privacy and her daughter's, she made clear that the weight of those years was not something she discussed lightly. But where does a life like this settle eventually? What does all of it look like when you finally have the distance to see it whole? Segment 1: The weight of a life like this. It is worth stepping back and looking at Catherine Oxenberg's life as a full picture rather than a sequence of events, because the sequence alone doesn't explain the person. She grew up between two worlds, the transatlantic world of her American businessman father, and the exiled European royal world of her mother, without fully belonging to either. She had lineage without a kingdom, heritage without territory, a place in the line of succession to the British throne that was more biographical footnote than lived reality. She spent her childhood moving between New York, London, and boarding schools in a family that broke apart when she was 5 and reshaped itself multiple times in the years that followed. Underneath the polished surface of that upbringing, the Cecil Beaton photographs and the acting lessons from Richard Burton and the Paris-educated pedigree, there was a child who had been hurt in ways she didn't speak about publicly for decades. The eating disorder that began in high school and followed her through modeling and acting was not an accident or a quirk of personality. It was a consequence of something that had happened to her when she was young, before any of the fame, before any of the cameras. A private battle that ran in parallel to every public milestone, invisible to the audiences watching her on television, but very much present in her daily life. She broke through in Hollywood on the back of her first ever audition, playing a princess because she more or less looked and carried herself like one. She was on the most watched television show in the world for 2 seasons. She hosted Saturday Night Live, and then she was fired in a salary dispute while abroad, in a way that her own publicist had to deny because the truth was too uncomfortable to acknowledge directly. The character she had played was recast, lasted 13 episodes, and vanished from the show forever. What followed was a career that required constant reinvention without the creative infrastructure to support it. Roman Holiday with the weight of Audrey Hepburn's legacy hanging over every scene, a horror film about a snake cult, a 1-season action series shot in Mexico, television movies that kept the work going without keeping her name in anyone's conversation for long. She married Robert Evans and had the marriage annulled in 9 days without public explanation. She raised a first daughter alone, whose father had been arrested for drug trafficking, a fact she never publicly addressed at the time, and could only have lived with in private. She built a new family with Casper Van Dien over 16 years, a large blended household that ended in divorce in 2015, and then NXIVM. 5 years of watching her daughter disappear into something she could not fully see, could not easily name, and could not reach her way out of through ordinary parental love. The threats, the slow and frustrating process of pushing law enforcement systems that moved cautiously against an organization that had built legal protection around itself carefully over many years. The New York Times investigation, the arrests, the trial, the sentence. Keith Raniere is serving 120 years in federal prison. India is alive, married, and a mother. The relationship between mother and daughter, which had nearly been destroyed completely, has been rebuilt. The Catherine Oxenberg Foundation continues its work. In June 2023, Catherine announced her engagement to businessman Ellis Jones, and they married later that year in a beachside ceremony. A new chapter that had taken a very long time to arrive. There is something quietly significant about the fact that the most important thing Catherine Oxenberg ever did had nothing to do with television. It happened in meetings with attorneys, in conversations with journalists, in phone calls she took while people were warning her to stop. And in years of patient grinding effort to reach a daughter who had been cut off from her own instincts. The actress who had once played a princess on screen turned out to need something much more unglamorous in real life. The willingness to keep going when the situation was frightening and the outcome was not guaranteed. The royal blood that opened doors for her was in the end the least interesting thing about her. The lineage that newspapers love to reference. The succession numbers, the connections to King Charles and King Felipe, and Grand Duchess Elena of Russia. None of that explains the woman who showed up at the New York Attorney General's office with a dossier. Who took phone calls she had been told were threats to her safety. And who kept going anyway. That part of the story has nothing to do with Dynasty, and nothing to do with Belgrade. It has to do with something that doesn't need a title in front of it. Catherine Oxenberg's story sits somewhere between things that can't be easily categorized. It's a Hollywood story. But not really. It's a story about royalty. But the royalty that mattered most to her was the child she raised. It's a story about loss. Of a kingdom that no longer existed. Of a marriage that lasted 9 days. Of a fame that came and then softened. And it's also ultimately a story about what a person does when none of that matters anymore. When the only thing left is a daughter in danger and a choice about whether to fight. She fought. And knowing what we know now about what was happening inside that organization, it is hard to imagine what might have been different if she hadn't. That's the life of Catherine Oxenberg. Not the one the headlines ever quite captured. But the real one. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.